There is a smell that no living person today has ever experienced, and that is a mercy. It was the smell of Victorian London in 1860. Coal smoke, thick enough to taste, open sewers running through cobblestone gutters, the rot of overcrowded tenements where entire families of 7 shared a single room the size of a modern bathroom. And somewhere inside all of that, somewhere behind iron gates and stone walls that the city preferred to ignore, were the children. Thousands of them, nameless, invisible, forgotten before they were even old enough to understand what forgetting meant. This is not a story about Oliver Twist. That was fiction, though Charles Dickens based it on investigations he conducted himself, walking through the worst slums of London at night, documenting what he saw with a journalist's eye and a human being's horror. What you are about to hear is the reality behind the story, and in many ways, the reality was worse. By 1860, London was the largest city on earth. It was the beating heart of the British Empire, the richest nation in the history of the world up to that point. Queen Victoria sat on her throne. The Great Exhibition of 1851 had dazzled the planet. Railways cut through the countryside. Telegraphs sent messages at the speed of lightning. And yet, in the shadows of all that progress, children were dying in institutions that were supposed to save them. Here's the number that should stop you cold. In 1861, the official census recorded 13,265 orphans and abandoned children inside workhouses across England. That's just the ones who were counted. Historians estimate thousands more lived in unregistered institutions, back-alley baby farms, or simply vanished into the streets entirely. How did this happen? How did one of the wealthiest empires in human history produce a system where children were treated worse than livestock? The answer begins with cholera and typhus and consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. Disease tore through Victorian working-class communities like a scythe. Florence Nightingale herself documented that 24 London hospitals had mortality rates exceeding 90%. Not from war, but from infection, from filth, from the basic failure of sanitation that wealthier Londoners simply didn't experience. F.B. Smith, the historian, confirmed it. Typhus, cholera, and consumption were the great executioners of Victorian adults. And when adults died, children were left behind. A child who lost both parents in 1860 had exactly 3 options. The first was relatives, grandparents, aunts, uncles, who might take them in, though often with reluctance and resentment that Dickens captured perfectly in novels like Bleak House and Great Expectations. The second option was the orphanage, and the third, for children turned away from orphanages or who had no one to bring them there, was the street. But here's what almost no one told you. For many of these children, the street was safer. The orphanage, that institution that sounds like rescue, like salvation, like society doing something right, was in many documented cases a place of systematic hunger, physical punishment, forced labor, and disease. The Great Coram's Foundling Hospital in London, one of the most respected institutions of its kind, was forced to turn away 5 out of every 6 children brought to its doorstep. 5 out of 6. And that was the good orphanage, the institutions that accepted everyone, the unregulated ones, the ones run by penny-pinching guardians who pocketed relief funds, was something else entirely. What was a child's life worth in 1860 England? Legally, formally, on paper, it was worth something. The Poor Law of 1834 had created an official system. Parliament had passed acts. Committees had deliberated, and yet the 1847 Consolidated General Order, the official rulebook for institutions housing children, actually had to specify in writing, as Article 136, that no child under 12 years of age shall be punished by confinement in a dark room during the night. They had to write that down, because it was happening. Think about that. The government didn't ban the practice of locking children in dark rooms as punishment. It merely restricted it. Children over 12? Fair game, apparently. This is the world we are entering. A world where the law itself tells you everything about what was considered normal. The Industrial Revolution had created something new in England, a massive urban poor. Factories needed workers, cities swelled, and the rural support networks that had once sustained struggling families, the church, the village, the extended community, dissolved in the scramble of urbanization. By the middle of the 19th century, in working-class London neighborhoods, children as young as 5 were already contributing to household income. By 10, many were working full-time. According to records from 1840, only 20% of London's children received any formal education. By 1860, that had risen to about half, which means half of the children in the richest city on earth were still receiving no schooling whatsoever. And for the orphans, the children with no parents to advocate for them, no family to complain on their behalf, no voice loud enough to be heard above the noise of empire, the numbers were even darker. Subscribe now if you've never heard this story before. Because what comes next, what actually happened inside those walls, is something history books have kept quiet for far too long. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Have you ever heard about Victorian orphanages before today? What you're about to discover in the next 3 chapters will completely change how you see this era. Stay with us. Inside the walls, what they called care. Imagine waking up before dawn, not because someone loves you and wants to give you breakfast, but because a bell is tolling, loud, iron, indifferent, and the consequence of not rising immediately is punishment. You are 7 years old. You share your bed with 3 other children. The mattress is thin enough to feel the wooden slats beneath it. The room smells of damp stone and unwashed bodies. There is no heat in winter. There are no blankets to spare. And this is supposedly the better option. This is the orphanage. By 1860, the institutions that housed London's orphaned and abandoned children existed on a spectrum of cruelty. On one end were the philanthropic establishments, places like the Orphan Working School, founded in 1758, or the various homes funded by wealthy Victorians who genuinely believed in charity. On the other end were institutions that were, in every meaningful sense of the word, prisons for children who had committed no crime except being poor and parentless. The food situation alone is enough to make a modern person's stomach turn, and not from eating it. Workhouse dietary tables from the era, confirmed by historians and analyzed by modern nutritionists, show that the daily rations provided to children in these institutions offered approximately 20% fewer calories than the absolute minimum a child needs to survive, and were severely deficient in vitamins and minerals. No fruits, no vegetables. The standard morning ration was gruel, half a cup of oats boiled in water with a pinch of salt. No milk, no sugar, no butter. For the rest of the day, there might be dry bread, a watery broth so salty it caused more thirst than it relieved. And if fortune smiled, a mug of weak, heavily diluted tea brewed from leaves that had been dried and reused multiple times. This is not interpretation. These are the documented dietary tables preserved in the National Archives, available to anyone who wants to look. Charles Dickens didn't invent Oliver Twist's famous plea, "Please, sir, I want some more." He documented it. Parishes were legally prohibited from offering second helpings. The law said no. A child who asked for more food was not just going hungry, they were, under the rules of the institution, being defiant. And defiance had consequences. Now, here is where we have to be honest about something that Victorian society preferred to discuss in euphemisms. The punishment of children in these institutions was not discipline, it was abuse, and it was legal. The 1847 Consolidated General Order, the official regulatory framework, specified in Articles 136 through 140 the rules around corporal punishment. Male children could be beaten with a rod or instrument approved by the guardians. Female children were, technically, exempt from corporal punishment under the official rules. But documented cases, investigated by reformers and published in newspapers of the era, show that girls were beaten too, often with a birch broom. The rules didn't prevent abuse. They just created the paperwork around it. Documented cases from the period include an 8-year-old boy flogged for 3 consecutive days because he complained to guardians that he had been unjustly beaten. A 13-year-old girl was beaten for leaving dirt in the corner of a room. 2 6-year-old boys were caned for falling asleep during a Sunday church service. In one of the most disturbing documented cases, an 8-year-old was placed inside a bag and suspended from a beam as punishment. Let that sink in. A child, in a bag, hung from a beam, as an officially administered punishment. In 1860 England, these weren't rumors. They were investigated, published and debated, and then largely ignored by a society that had decided the poor deserved their poverty, and that the children of the poor needed to be shaped into productive laborers, not coddled. The sleeping arrangements compounded everything. In one investigated workhouse dormitory, 104 girls were found sleeping 4 or more to a bed in a room just 7 feet high, 16 feet wide, and 88 feet long. The beds were pressed together with barely space to stand between them. Ventilation was essentially non-existent. Disease, measles, smallpox, scarlet fever, typhus moved through these dormitories with terrifying speed because once one child was sick, every child was exposed. And here is the cruel irony that Victorian reformers pointed out again and again to almost no effect. The poor sanitation and overcrowding of orphanages and workhouses actually created the conditions for the diseases that were killing the parents in the first place. The city was a machine that manufactured orphans and then built institutions that were barely adequate to keep those orphans alive and sometimes weren't. Here is a question worth sitting with. If a child's chance of survival was roughly equal on the streets and inside an institution, why did society so desperately want to lock them away? The answer, when you read the historical record honestly, has less to do with compassion and more to do with appearance. The sight of ragged children begging on London streets embarrassed the empire. They were inconvenient. They disturbed the middle-class vision of a prosperous, orderly Britain. The orphanage didn't exist primarily to save children. It existed to remove them from public view. The reformers knew it. Dickens knew it. Lord Shaftesbury, who spent decades fighting for child labour laws and the ragged school movement, knew it. But knowing and changing are two very different things, especially when the people who benefit from cheap, controllable child labour are also the people writing the laws. Drop a comment right now. Did you know any of this? Most people raised on the romantic image of Victorian England have no idea. What else have we been taught to overlook? The machine that used them up. There is a word that Victorian England used constantly when it came to orphans and poor children. Useful. Not happy, not healthy, not loved. Useful. From the moment a child entered the system, whether a workhouse, an orphanage, or a ragged school, the primary question the institution asked was not how do we help this child? The question was, what can this child do for us? And in 1860 the answer was quite a lot. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England's economy, but it had also transformed the labour market in ways that made children extraordinarily valuable to factory owners, mine operators, and manufacturers. Children were small. Their fingers could reach into machinery that adult hands couldn't. They were fast learners. They were easily intimidated. And above all, they were cheap. In documented wage records from the period, children working in households as servants were paid approximately half a penny per hour, working up to 80 hours per week. By the middle of the 19th century, roughly 120,000 children in London alone were employed as domestic servants under those conditions. But for orphaned children, children with no parents to negotiate on their behalf, no family to complain to the parish, no one watching, the situation was worse. The system of apprenticeship, theoretically designed to give children a trade and a future, was in practice frequently a form of indentured servitude. Parish workhouses could legally bind orphaned children to a master for a period of 7 years. During that apprenticeship, the child received no wages. The master provided accommodation and clothing. But there was no enforcement mechanism, no regular inspection, no reliable way for a child to report abuse. Records published in Reynolds's newspaper in the 1890s, drawing on decades of documented cases, include accounts of apprentices being flogged by their masters with virtually no legal consequence. The master's word almost always outweighed the child's. And it wasn't just domestic service or trade apprenticeships. Children from orphanages were hired out, a term that should make anyone uncomfortable because it means exactly what it sounds like, to factories and mines. In coal mines, children as young as 5 were used as trappers, sitting alone in the dark for up to 12 hours a day, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal carts passed. Older children worked as hurriers, pulling heavy coal carts through passages too narrow for adults. The work left permanent physical damage, curved spines, damaged knees, respiratory diseases that would kill them before they were 30. The Factory Acts of 1833 had attempted to limit child labor in textile factories. No children under 9, no more than 9 hours a day for those under 13. But enforcement was almost non-existent, inspectors were few, and the acts didn't cover mines at all until 1842, or agriculture or domestic service, or the hundreds of other industries that use children. And for orphaned children placed by institutions, even these weak protections were frequently irrelevant because the institution, not the child, made the arrangements. Here's the number that tells the real story. In 1840, only 20% of London's children received any education at all. By 1860, this had risen to approximately half, meaning that in the world's most powerful empire, in one of its greatest cities, half of all children were still being denied the most basic tool for escaping poverty. For orphanage children, education was, at best, functional and minimal. The 1847 regulations required at least 3 hours of schooling per day: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction. 3 hours. The rest of the child's day was work: cooking, cleaning, laundry, sewing, maintaining the institution itself. The orphanage was self-sufficient because its unpaid child labor made it so. And what were they being educated for? Not for freedom, not for opportunity. The explicit purpose of orphanage education, as stated in the records of multiple institutions, was to prepare children for lower middle-class occupations. Girls were trained to be governesses or domestic servants. Boys were prepared for trade apprenticeships. The system was not designed to lift children out of poverty. It was designed to produce a specific class of controllable, compliant workers who would slot neatly into the bottom rungs of Victorian society. This is not cynicism. This is what the reformers themselves said. People like Lord Shaftesbury, like Mary Carpenter, who founded the reformatory school movement, like Dr. Thomas John Barnardo, who in the late 1860s would begin documenting what he found in East London's streets, and ultimately establish the institution that bears his name today. These were people who looked at the system from the inside, who worked within it, and who said openly, "This is not charity. This is exploitation with a charitable mask." Mary Carpenter, writing in the 1850s and 1860s, was particularly scathing. She argued that the institutionalization of poor children was fundamentally about social control, about making the poor invisible and manageable, rather than about genuine care. And the physical toll of this system on children's bodies was permanent. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency from malnutrition and lack of sunlight, was endemic in institutional children. Tuberculosis spread through dormitories. Eye infections caused by dirty conditions left children partially or fully blind. Children who entered orphanages at 4 or 5 years old often emerged at 14, pushed out to make room for newer arrivals, with broken health, no family, minimal education, and a lifetime of conditioned subservience. The street had been dangerous, but it had at least been free. If you've made it this far, you already understand something most people don't. Comment below and tell us what surprised you most. And stay with us, because Chapter 4 contains the most important question of all. Did anything actually change? Voices from the rubble. Reform, resistance, and what was left. By the mid-1860s, something was shifting in Victorian England. Not quickly, not cleanly, and not without enormous resistance from the very people who profited from keeping things exactly as they were. But the voices of reform, persistent, documented, furious, were getting harder to ignore. The man who did more than perhaps anyone else to expose the Victorian orphanage and workhouse system was not a politician or a reformer. He was a novelist. Charles Dickens had published Oliver Twist in 1837 to 1839, using fiction to say what journalism couldn't get away with at the time. The novel's portrayal of Bumble the Beadle, the smug, corrupt workhouse administrator, was not satire. It was portraiture. Dickens had walked those institutions. He had spoken to the children. He knew. But Dickens was one voice in a culture that was deeply resistant to the idea that its charitable institutions might be doing harm. The prevailing philosophy, articulated clearly in the Poor Law of 1834 and its supporting documents, was that poverty was fundamentally a moral failing. The poor were poor because they were lazy, improvident, or morally weak. And children of the poor, by extension, carried that moral contamination and needed to be corrected, shaped, disciplined. Charity in this framework was something to be given sparingly and grudgingly, lest it encouraged dependency. This philosophy, that poverty is a character flaw rather than a social condition, was the intellectual foundation of every abuse documented in those institutions. And it had powerful defenders. The economists who supported it, the clergy who preached it, the factory owners who benefited from it, the politicians who legislated it. Against all of them stood a small, fierce, often ignored group of reformers who insisted on doing something radical. They listened to the children. Mary Carpenter is perhaps the most important figure most people have never heard of. A Bristol-born educator and social reformer, Carpenter spent the 1850s and 1860s conducting systematic investigations into the conditions of poor and institutionalized children. She published her findings, Reformatory Schools for the Children of the Perishing and Dangerous Classes in 1851, Juvenile Delinquents in 1853. She testified before parliamentary committees. She argued with documented evidence that the existing system was not rehabilitating children, it was criminalizing them. Her statistics were damning. Approximately 60% of the criminal population, by the records of the period, had passed through institutions, orphanages, workhouses, reformatories during childhood. The institutions that were supposed to prevent crime were producing it. Not because the children were inherently criminal, but because the institutions had stripped them of everything: dignity, education, family bonds, health, and then released them onto streets they had no tools to navigate. Lord Shaftesbury, who had championed the Factory Acts limiting child labour in mines and mills, continued pushing throughout the 1860s for the ragged school movement, free schools established in the poorest districts of London that at least attempted to give street children and orphans basic literacy without the institutional brutality of the workhouse system. By the mid-1860s, ragged schools were educating tens of thousands of children who had no other options. But it was a young medical student named Thomas John Barnardo who, in 1866, would change the conversation permanently. Barnardo arrived in London's East End, intending to study medicine before going to China as a missionary. What he found in the streets of Stepney and Whitechapel stopped him cold. He documented, with the methodical precision of a doctor, the exact numbers and conditions of homeless children sleeping in the open, in empty barrels under bridges, in the doorways of buildings that housed working adults who could not or would not help them. One story Barnardo told repeatedly, and which he documented carefully because he understood that his critics would challenge him, was of a boy named Jim Jarvis, who led him one night to a rooftop where 11 children slept in the open, without shelter in winter. Barnardo investigated further. He found more. When he approached the local orphanage authorities about admitting these children, he was told there was no room. When he tried to place children in existing institutions, he encountered the same wall. The orphanages were full, or they only accepted children of specific religious denominations, or they required fees that no one could pay, or they had waiting lists that stretched for years. So Bernardo built his own. In 1867, he opened his first small home for boys in Stepney Causeway. The rule he established, no destitute child ever refused admission, was revolutionary. It was the direct repudiation of the system that had existed for the past 3 decades. And what did his investigations find about the children who came through his doors? Malnourished, diseased, scarred, often literally, by physical punishment. Many had spent time in official orphanages and workhouses before ending up on the streets. The institution had failed them. The street had been their escape. The Victorian orphanage system did not end in 1860 or 1870 or even 1880. It evolved slowly, grudgingly, under relentless pressure from reformers, investigative journalists, and a public conscience that was, generation by generation, becoming less willing to accept the idea that children born into poverty deserve to suffer for it. The Education Act of 1870 finally established state-funded elementary schools across England, a monumental change that meant, for the first time, that education was not dependent on charity or the mercy of an institution. The Factory Acts were strengthened. The Custody of Infants Act improved protections for children. The reformatories were reformed. But for the children of 1860, for the thousands who passed through those stone corridors, who slept 4 to a bed, who ate gruel for breakfast and were beaten for crying, history arrived too late. Their names were not recorded. Their stories were not told. They survived or they didn't. And the empire that created their conditions celebrated itself as the most civilized nation on earth. We owe it to them to know better. We owe it to them to say clearly, this happened, it was documented, it was real, and the children who endured it deserved infinitely more than what they received from the society that was supposed to protect them. If this documentary moved you, subscribe, share it, leave a comment with your name, your country, and what this history means to you. Because the best thing we can do for children who were never given a voice is make sure their story is never forgotten.